The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi, everybody. This is Peter Evers, and welcome to another edition of Humanity First. Today, we're going to be very topical. We have two guests who are quite often on the show. We've got Dean Spiliotes, who is a civic scholar at Southern New Hampshire University, who is a real sort of observer of world politics and what's going on in America at the moment. And Chris Ryan is going to join us as well. He is the co-host of the morning show of New Hampshire Today. Today, we're going to talk about political violence in the wake of the murder of Charlie Kirk and other fairly vicious and murderous acts that we're witnessing in this country. And we're going to ask the question, what is going on in this country and why are people reverting to this kind of violence? And even more so, how come people are supporting that violence, whether it's on one side of the political fence or the other? What kind of an environment is encouraging people to support that kind of violence? Because in my opinion, our democracy is under great threat when political violence solves the problems of the day. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about how people in the street, the everyday person, is affected by an environment of sort of hatred and lack of desire to bring people together. So Dean and Chris are going to join us, and we'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMSI, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMSI because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamsijobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Welcome back, everybody, to Humanity First. And as promised at the top of the show, we have two of the great minds of civics and public discourse. We have Dean Spiliotes, who has been on this show a number of times. Dean, hi.
Hey, Peter.
And Dean, of course, is the civics scholar at Southern New Hampshire University. And also with us is Chris Ryan, another veteran of various shows that we've done over the years, which goes back about a decade, right, Chris?
Indeed, and you gave us that great intro. I was wondering who you guys had on the show today, but apparently it's just Dean and I.
And of course, anybody who listens to the radio up in New Hampshire will know that voice as the voice of New Hampshire Today in the morning. Chris and Dean, welcome. Well, the subject today is one that is probably catching the attention of most of the people in America. And I can say, having just got back from the UK and Ireland, the rest of the world as well, and that is this theme of the uptick in political violence in this country. And again, you know, if you look at what's happening throughout the world, especially in places like Europe, there is an upswing in the unpredictable violence that comes from discourse in this country. I was actually on a Quality Council meeting this morning at work, and we took 5 or 10 minutes to talk about how that is affecting our work. And how public discourse is becoming more and more polemic. And we've seen it and we've witnessed it. And it's becoming more and more prevalent and also more tolerable, it would seem. You know, if you want to go back a few years, this behavior would not even be sanctioned in this country. And I'm not actually talking about the acts of violence, we'll get that, but some of the things that have been said across the table. And so, you know, when we had the murder of Charlie Kirk 2 or 3 weeks ago, his widow said that she forgave the perpetrator of the act. And President Trump came back onto the stage and says, I don't agree with that. I want my enemies to fail. of my opponents to fail. And that was another one of those moments where you begin to think there isn't a desire for consensus in this country at the moment. Dean, can we start with you? What about that statement? Has our desire for consensus disappeared at the moment?
It feels like it. It used to be the case that the big selling point for any major elected official or candidate for major office was the ability to bring people together and to work towards a bipartisanship. And so that was kind of the way to go as a politician. And whether it was George W. Bush or Barack Obama promising to bring people together, or in Bush's case, be a uniter, not a divider, it often fell short in practice. But it was a goal to which elected officials aspired. And today it's very different. Bipartisanship, a willingness to cede ground, to reach a compromise, is viewed as a sign of weakness, in a sense, political weakness. There really is kind of an us against them, almost tribal mentality that has taken over our politics in a way that I haven't seen in my life. I mean, politics has always been nasty as far back as I can remember, and my political memory goes back into the early mid 70s. Politics has always been nasty at times. There's always been real tension between the parties, but this feels a little different. And I think, we can get into it. I think a lot of it has to do with technology, social media, and the blurring of kind of public and private domains, how people talk and behave in private used to often be very different than what they said for public consumption. That line has been completely blurred, if not erased at this point.
Yeah. Chris, how did we get here? And you interview a lot of people, you speak to people on a daily basis. Do you get the impression that that notion of civil discourse is really kind of old-fashioned now, and you make your stripes by pinning your colors to a particular mask and despising the other one?
Yeah, I think, within our politics, the individuals that engage in, bad behavior when it comes to discourse are the minority. And I think that a lot of them exist within the shadows, either using pseudonyms or fake avatars on social media. I think for the most part, our leaders are individuals that want to carry out things with high degrees of decorum. But we have seen a dramatic shift to the point where no one really knows where the line is anymore. In the past, there were gatekeepers in media, and those folks kind of determined what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable. And you mentioned the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's killing, where depending on where the political ideology was or what the group was involved, you could either say whatever you wanted, or you could be fired for saying whatever you wanted. And that's the major conundrum at this point, is that there is no real kind of adults in the room to kind of determine what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. We're in the Wild West when it comes to our own kind of media and individual personas. And so it's basically whatever you want, which is good and bad. And so however you want to carry yourself, however you want to engage, that is the way that folks are doing so. And the arbiter of all of this, when it comes to politics, are the voters. And the voters determine what they want and what they don't want. So we can point to the political figures and say, oh, look at that, Donald Trump's behaving badly, or this person's behaving badly. Well, those are the individuals that won the elections. And so if you don't want politicians behaving in a certain way, you want politicians to work together. Don't, vote for institutional arsonists to take on these various positions.
So do these institutional arsonists, are they taking a leaf out of the book of how politicians are behaving? I think about the murder of Charlie Kirk, and of course, I immediately go back to the murder of the Minnesotan rep, which was about 3 weeks before. And it seems to me that we're picking sides, right? One side will say, well, what about this terrible thing, flags at half-mast for this person? And the other side will say, well, what about the other? Dean, here's a question for you. How do you meet that as the political opposition, right? We've seen Gavin Newsom fighting with fire with fire around gerrymandering, right? And my first response to that is, do you want to be as outrageously partisan as the other side are? But if you aren't, do you get left in the dust? And so do we have an arms race here of the widening of that gap and the hatred and the eventual natural political violence?
Yeah, I mean, we have really an almost saturated media environment at this point, where there are so many people, not only legacy media outlets, but all kinds of individual influencers and podcasters and professional trolls online, and there's such a competition for attention, for clicks. In some cases just for the attention, but in other cases to monetize whatever the issue is at hand. And so when you have that kind of a competition, you have to be more and more outrageous. You have to be louder and louder and more in the face of whomever it is that you're targeting. And so I just think it's a different media environment now, really driven by technology. What I find is, how should you mentioned, how should the opposition deal with something that is in their face like that? Sometimes the best thing to do is just to not say anything, to just pause, take a break. We have an instantaneous news cycle now in which stuff is reported in real time. I've talked to journalists over the years who have said, in the old days, we would have a couple days to check our sources on a story. Now you start posting about it on social media as it's happening. Or we see the video as it's happening. And so the speed and the volume of communication that we now have access to in our lives it's like the proverbial fire hose. And so people are trying to figure out how to get attention, how to stand out. And so it just feels very different than it used to. It's a lot harder. The rules, the rules of the road, or the rules of engagement, standard operating procedures, all that stuff. It's really now subject to interpretation and dispute. We're not all necessarily following the same rule book anymore.
Yeah, it frightened me a little bit when I heard James Carville, who I respect a great deal, say a few weeks ago that we should just wait and see how this thing implodes. I thought that in a way was an abdication of responsibility of somebody who strives for civic discourse and the idea of a democracy. Chris, you meet a lot of people. How do you think this is sort of spilling out into our everyday discourse as human beings?
I think from a political standpoint, political figures are generally not leaders; they're followers. And they are waiting to see how this plays out to determine exactly what their route is going to be. Really, the first Democrat of any prominence that is trying to engage at the level that Trump engages in his counterparts is Gavin Newsom. And so folks are going to wait and see how that plays out. Now, Newsom's way too early 2020 poll numbers have indicated that he's having success with this. So are others going to follow? Generally, Democrats were taking on, what you described earlier as from Carville's, which is the play dead approach, where work with Trump in some things, but don't chase every ball that he throws, and just kind of move forward, do your thing. If there's opportunities to work with the president and with Republicans, do it. If not, don't. And mostly just kind of stay quiet and not make any real news. And Newsom has changed that. Other governors have tried to change that. The government shutdown is interesting because I'm interested to see how Democrats handle that, because I feel that Dean was mentioning, a lot of times the political figures have kind of fallen to the backdrop when it comes to the attention and the clickbait, where it's the influencers that are making the most noise. It's the podcasters that are making the most noise. The politicians have kind of sifted to the backdrop. In terms of everyday people, for the most part, they are just trying to keep this to the outside and just function and move forward. There's a huge amount of apathy as the left and the right have gotten more powerful and loud and will squash anything that provides any sort of a opposition to them verbally. The folks in the middle are more and more sidelined and totally apathetic and somewhat afraid of the current political environment.
Yeah.
Well, in a weird way, the current politicians are trying to serve a new set of masters on social media. They're less focused now on trying to influence, the editorial page of the New York Times or the Washington Post, and they're a lot more concerned about getting the approval and or the attention of these, podcasters with millions of listeners, whether it's a Joe Rogan or the late Charlie Kirk is obviously another example. Ben Shapiro. We can name any number. Theo Vaughn. There are all these podcasters with massive audiences now, and politicians look to them, take the lead from them, kind of filter what they say through kind of the whatever the conventional wisdom is on social media. It's not so much just the legacy media anymore.
That it just struck me that I used to be really enamored with politicians when I was younger. I have to say, a little let shine as one
Yeah.
off. The more I've met over the years, there's some great politicians. But I remember in the UK, the Conservatives brought up the idea of bringing back the death penalty, which, of course, as you know, hasn't been in effect since 1962. And it was a very popular thing with people of Britain. They thought that vengeance should be a big part of punishment, of the ultimate vengeance. But politicians actually took that on as a debate to look at the morality of a nation state taking the life of a citizen and engaged in debate. They led that debate. And in the end, that fell, and we still don't have the death penalty or they don't still have the death penalty in Britain. That's a very different scenario than you're putting forward. You're now putting forward a scenario where politicians are waiting to see where the wind blows. And Rep. Fagan in Taunton 15 years ago, when I was on a stage with him, said the greatest enemy of democracy is cynicism. And when cynicism takes place, people don't feel as if they have skin in the game, if you like. And I wonder if this is contributing to our political violence, people feeling that there's no real direction or way to get back to have a voice. And that is expressed by very few people in violent acts. But what's really important to note is that it doesn't matter which side of the political fence you are. If you start solving political issues with violence, you've lost your democracy, or you're on the way to losing your democracy. That change is huge. I know it's probably an obvious observation for you guys, but it just strikes me that we're losing a bit of direction there, Dean.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned how when you said when you were younger, you really looked up to politicians. I interned in the U.S. Senate 45 years ago as a college student, and I remember it was like the pantheon. It was like, oh look, there's Ted Kennedy, there's William Proxmire, there's all these like sort of titans of the U.S. Senate. And I don't know if it was my youthful idealism and behavior was always maybe a little more cynical than I would like to remember. But there is an element of the sort of politicians being cynical or jaded. I think, as Chris said at the beginning of the show, I think many of them they want to be leaders and they want to do the right thing, but navigating the current like political environment, the current cultural environment, proves to be very challenging. I mean, there are incentives in the environment now that sort of change behavior in ways that are maybe not as desirable as we would like.
Yeah, yeah. And Chris, what would you say to those people who are feeling more or less excluded from the political process, who might be thinking of other ways to make a mark?
Yeah, I think that Dean makes a good point. When I first started, it's kind of the same thing, right? You have tremendous admiration for folks, then you start to meet them, and it all kind of changes, right? So yeah, I think that obviously, in no way, shape, or form is violence acceptable within or should be acceptable within our society. However, political violence has unfortunately a significant role in American history. The hope was, that we were on a arc of growth, that we were going to be able to have a time period a sustained time period where we would be able to solve our problems, by being rational and by, going through and having honest debate. But in our system, there is a lot of gray area, for greed, a lot of gray area for money, for personal gain, and for folks to make the decisions about how they want to engage. And for the average American, they look at this and they're angry, and their cynicism is warranted. It's not a cynicism that is without reason. Is it perhaps too great? And are they too cynical? Maybe, but they have reason to be cynical. There is definitely, reason for that to take place. The problem is that I don't feel that a lot of these circumstances are necessarily just because of politics. I think that there's, and Peter, you can speak to this the best out of any of us, I think there's a lot of problems that go into an individual making a decision that they're going to take the life of another or a group of individuals and basically exchange it for their own. I think there's mental health. I think there's economic circumstances and an overall sense of hopelessness that far exceeds what is quote unquote the motive of political violence.
Yeah, and we're running out of time, but I always like to sort of think about a positive way to finish a conversation like this. And there is a cyclical nature to the dialogue in any country. Anybody who's been around for a while knows. I remember I heard a politician say when Trump got in for a second time, well, sometimes the Democrats kick our butts and sometimes we kick theirs. It's so much deeper than that, right? It's so much, it is so much more, but that pendulum does swing. And I think we're in the middle of one of those cycles. And America is a very strong democracy, and it takes an awful lot to knock it off. So those rumors of America's democracy in demise, I think, are way premature. And it's these kind of conversations, I think, that keep that going. So I want to thank you both for another great conversation. And really, we should come back and see where we are in a few months' time. Dean and Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.